I think this session, in a sense, will be a continuation of some of the themes that they've already been talking about, but we'll look at them in a different way, I hope, and delve a little bit deeper. The title of the session is rather mysterious, The Other. It's really an abbreviation of one that I had sent in earlier. And of course, it's a concept that has quite a long and distinguished history in the 20th century. The notion of the other was first formulated by the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre in describing the dilemma of sort of 20th century individuals, in the sense that they were estranged or alienated from a true sense of existence, of their own subjective existence, by the roles that other people foisted upon them, and so that they would dwell somehow in identities that were derived from the eyes of others, from other people looking at them in a certain kind of role, rather than experiencing their own existence in and of itself. And so this is where this idea of the other originated, really, as a form of estrangement or alienation. And then a generation later, it was taken a bit further and describing a dilemma that is experienced not just by individuals, but by ethnicities, by nations, by cultures, by Edward Said, who talked about the Orient, the idea of the Orient, in his famous book about Orientalism, as a construct or a form of discourse that Western imperialist powers used in describing the Oriental world, as they called it, as something extremely strange and exotic and very different from the West. And in doing this, what they were actually doing at the same time was reinforcing their own narratives of power, of colonialism, of domination in those other parts of the world. And so the other was a form of exercising domination and power over cultures and nations that were seen very much as inferior. So we have these two forms, these two sort of very important touchstones of what the other is, and we're here to talk about it today. What is its relevance? Is it time to move beyond these two discourses to something else, and if so, what would that be like? So joining us today, we have right here to my left is Nadim Aslam, who has just published his new book, which he's holding in his hand, The Blind Man's Garden. He is an author of Maps for Lost Lovers as well, and Season of the Rainbirds and The Wasted Vigil. So this is your fourth novel. Born in Pakistan, moved to England as a teenager, and nominated for numerous prizes, and has been gaining a lot of attention recently with his latest novel. Next we have Camilla Shamsi, very well known to the KLF, who also was born here in Karachi, but grew up to some extent overseas, I think. Grew up here, studied overseas, right. And also has just published 5 novels, I think I heard you say earlier today. So Burnt Shadows, Broken Verse, The City by the Sea, or some of the ones you might know, Cartography. Also nominated for numerous awards. And then finally, H.M. Naqvi, whose novel Homeboy won the South Asian Prize 2 years ago. And that was the big news 2 years ago when we first came to the KLF. Also born here in Pakistan and lived some time overseas studying. So what the three of you actually have in common is this kind of bicultural experience, I would say, of having started life in one place, lived for significant periods of time elsewhere, come back here again. And I'd like to just start out by throwing out the question, to what extent has your own biographical experience of straddling two worlds or multiple worlds, and perhaps feeling as an outsider in some sense or not, influenced your writing or maybe pushed you into being a writer? has this experience shaped the kinds of themes that you're dealing with in your work?
Who do you want
Ladies
to
first, or?
I think when people talk about the bicultural experience and when they're talking to me, because I do now live in London and I was at university in America, although I grew up in Karachi, and they always talk to me about physically going abroad. But for me, the most significant experience of living in different cultures has to do with the fact that I grew up English-speaking and obsessed with novels in Karachi. So I grew up and I was always reading, for me a day was marked by reading a novel. It started when you started the novel, it ended when you ended the novel. And the novels I was reading were in the English language, which meant they were not about the world around me. I wasn't reading books about Karachi. And so to me, that's the really significant thing as a writer. If you want to be a writer from a very early age, but your idea of novels is things that happen somewhere else. And what would a novel about Karachi in the English language look like? For a very long time, I didn't know. And as a child, I used to write, in the front row here, we have Ruby Haider, whose son Asad was my closest friend, and we wrote novels together at the age of 11, 12, 13. And they were novels without a specific location. They were sort of fantasy. They were about time machines or, the afterlife of dogs. Because I don't think either of us knew, or that many people growing up then in Karachi knew what it was to imagine a novel set in Karachi in the English language. And it took me a while to actually work out, and reading Midnight Children was the first time, because there's a section in Karachi. It was the first time I was reading this thing I love, the English language novel, and the world I lived in was there. And then to want to add to that. That was the really significant, and far, far more significant to me, actually, than physically going to America or physically going to England.
I would like to move on from that and say that I was here until I was almost 15, and I went to an Urdu medium school, so I was also reading, but I was reading Urdu novels. Yeah. And so the things that I was reading in novels by Ismat Chughtai, by Abdullah Hussain, by Intizar Hussain, by Manto, they were there around me. So what happened to you when you saw the section in Karachi set in Midnight Children? Yeah. That didn't happen to me, because that was there for me all the time, as it were. And earlier in my session I was speaking about, and then I did go to the West, and I didn't come back for 20 plus years. So all my sort of education in the arts more or less began to happen there. And as I was explaining in my earlier session, that when I came back and went to an art gallery in Lahore, and then I went to an art gallery in New Delhi, and I was wandering around the corridors, something happened to me that I couldn't quite pinpoint what it was, and which took me months to process and work out, which was that everyone on the walls, everyone in the paintings looked like me. That was the first time in 20 years I had gone into an art gallery and not seen. But then there is one step further, in that if you go to the National Gallery in London and you see a Caravaggio and you see a boy being bitten by the lizard. So this is what arts do. This is what art does, in that I didn't see a white child being bitten by a lizard. I eventually saw a child, because I remembered what it was like to be afraid of a lizard. Yeah. And so when you see, so that too happened in a way that, yes.
Multiculturalism has become part of discourse. It's spoken about, written about, thought about. But in a way, it's a very old concept. So as far as I'm concerned, my family a millennia ago began a journey that took them from Samarra in northern Iraq to Central Asia, to Punjab, to Uch, to UP and Bihar. So, in a way, we have always, the traditions that inform my sensibilities have been multicultural for a millennia. And now our family has been in Karachi for, 60 years or so, and we don't know where the next 60 years will lead us. As far as Karachi is concerned, Karachi is intrinsically, inherently multicultural also. So, I'm a Mohajir, and in Karachi one contends with different traditions. Pathans inhabit Karachi, Hindus, Christians, Punjabis, Balochis, Sindhis. So Karachi is intrinsically multicultural. So even without leaving Karachi, I feel that I'm informed by many disparate traditions, by disparate cultures. And in my next novel, I attempt to fuse these traditions into some sort of coherence, which is what we in the city do on a day-to-day basis.
But your novel Homeboy is very much about, a Pakistani boy, maybe something like yourself years ago, living in New York, and so what happens to them right after 9/11. To what extent does that perhaps reflect some experience of yours living as a Pakistani in the United States? Is there any autographical basis there, or is it just a metaphor for something else going on?
Homeboy, I did some calculations, and Homeboy is 14% autobiographical.
14?
40.
1-4. Okay.
So yes, I mean, the characters are facets of my persona, and I happen to be living in the States at a fraught juncture of history, and I did channel my anxieties into Homeboy. For instance, I lost a friend on 9/11, a friend who I drink with on the Upper West Side. I was in New York for 2 years. I'm not a New Yorker by any stretch, but a friend who was from Lahore, was self-made, and happened to be at a conference that morning at the World Trade Center. And so that there was this visceral shock that I am somehow connected to this historical vicissitude, and how do I make sense of it? And another anxiety was that my brother was who's sort of very professionally accomplished and can pass for he can pass for a Pathan or an Italian or an Israeli, was visited by the FBI, and that again caused anxiety. And so there were many anxieties at that time, and those anxieties found themselves into Homeboy.
What about autobiographical?
I would like to again pick up on something Hecham said, which is that when I was 15 and I went to England, I was traumatized by the fact of racism, because up until that age, if someone didn't like me, it was based on their experience of me. They had met me, there had been interaction, we had talked, and they'd said, I don't like him because of his ideas, because of etc., etc. Racism meant that somebody could just look at me and decide, I don't like him. Or not even that, they could look at my name and say, I don't want anything to do with this person. So I was in shock but having had those 15 years in Pakistan was very important, which helped me get over racism, I think it was literally a matter of months. In that I knew that some of the world's greatest writers, some of the world's greatest painters, some of the world's greatest singers, some of the world's greatest thinkers, some of the world's greatest leaders, politicians, were from my part of the world. So when I was told that you are inferior because of where you come from, and I had had these 15 years and I had had that knowledge, I said, actually, you are wrong. You don't know what you're talking about. So it was which is different from the relationship which my cousins who were born in England have. Because they have internalized racism in a really complicated manner, in that they haven't had the 15 years of this knowledge. So when they are told that you're inferior, it is a complex thing. That it is for them very difficult to get over the fact of racism. But now that I was very much a child, 15, I wasn't at risk as an adult in Pakistan, as it were. Now, of course, I know that racism exists here. The idea of ask the Hindus, ask the Christians, so at that time I didn't know. So the other existed here too, as it were, but I just didn't know. But I'm just explaining that how I got over the idea of the other.
Of the other. Well, how would you say, though, Said was writing in a very particular time in a post-colonial period about the colonial period and its immediate aftermath. How have these narratives, to use a word that we've been hearing today, how have these narratives in the relationship between the West and the East changed? Would you say now new narratives have supplanted those that he describes of, the exotic, the strange, as, and implicitly the inferior as being the other? Are there new narratives now since 9/11?
I mean, I think it is stunning the degree to which, if you read Orientalism today, it still stands. There are slightly different variations on it, and certainly with Pakistan, we've gone from being Indo-Pak to being Af-Pak, right? I mean, it's almost as though geographically we moved. We are now talked of as the Greater Middle East, which is another code word for saying that troublesome Muslim region. So there is a way in which the Muslim in the imagination, and if you go back to the Crusades, it's a very long story, this narrative of, we say the West versus Islam, but really we're talking the Christian world and the Muslim world, however secular or profane those may be. And because when you have a very, very old narrative, there are points when it can lie more dormant, but when it comes up again, there are those 1,500 years of 1,000 years of things to draw up on. And we have seen a spike in that. And it was a very weird thing to be, I had a novel out, Cartography, which was out early 2002. And suddenly I was being invited to festivals around the world in which I hadn't been for my previous two novels. And everyone wanted to put me on a Muslim panel.
Oh.
And it was, so there was this weird moment where everyone wanted a Muslim to speak about who knows what. They would put 3 Muslims on a panel. Of course, there'd be an Egyptian and a Turk and a Pakistani. And we'd spend the whole time saying, well, the particular history of my country is such that what is true for you is not true for me. And you have to understand the politics of what happened in Pakistan in 1988 and 1982 to happen. So this figure of the Muslim, has certainly become, and the Muslim as the other has cropped up, but it's not a new thing. Things after 9/11 didn't feel new; they felt heightened and exaggerated. That things, it was all already there. If it hadn't all already been there, there wouldn't have been such a wellspring of stuff for it to come out. And I think a lot of the novels, whether it's H.M.'s or Nadeem's, are actually, looking at that these things that were already at a certain level, there was a spike, and there was a corresponding spike in a different way in this part of the world.
That's a very good way of describing it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think you put it cogently. I often wonder as a novelist, what, as a novelist, what is my responsibility? And in a way that perhaps, I don't know, Flaubert didn't. Let me put it this way. Naipaul is a very political writer. He writes about the post-colonial condition. He writes about the anxieties that define the East and the West. Even his early comedies are expositions on the third world, the predicament of the third world. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, you've got somebody like Nabokov. Nabokov escaped communist Russia. His family was white Russian. He escaped communist Russia, never to return again. Something we on this panel and few in this room have ever experienced. And Nabokov, who was born of this cataclysmic historical political development, never wrote about politics. And in a way, he wrote about an old man falling in love with a pubescent girl, a prepubescent girl. Lolita is one of the greatest novels of the 20th century, and yet it's sort of almost replete of what one would expect. Now, H.M. Naqvi is sort of alphabetically between Naipaul and Nabokov, and I'm tugged by both imperatives to try to engage with the realities that we are discussing, and to try to write like, I don't aspire to write like Nabokov. I'm not such a, I don't, हमें इतनी सलाहियत नहीं है. But these are two, I find, ends of the spectrum, and I find myself always trying to figure out where I stand.
Is it even possible to be a novelist in this region, in the world today, and write like Nabokov?
Sure.
To write sort of apolitically?
Well, novelists can do anything they want. I wouldn't presume to tell anyone anything. They can write. But personally speaking, yes, I would quote Toni Morrison, who said that I owe a lot of debt to the kids who got their heads blown off in the streets in the 60s. And she was talking about the turmoil of the 60s. And she said that I feel most satisfied, most happy with my work when it's an artistic achievement as well as paying off some of the debt I feel I owe to my comrades, as it were. So that is me. And I actually, H.M. brought up Nabokov. And yes, Nabokov said, I don't care about politics. And but there is also Dostoevsky, who did care about politics, Orwell, Mario Vargas Llosa, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Nadine Gordimer, Czeslaw Milosz. How far do you want to go back? Emile Zola. Political horror is at the center of the New Testament. If you look at through secular eyes, what is the story of the death of Christ, if not about the corruption and compromises within a political system? So if you wish to tell this story, it's fine, as long as ultimately you must remember that these things are novels, that they too have their rules. The ingredients can vary, but a novel ultimately will have to have certain rules. And,
Nadeem,
and they must be followed. Yes.
Thank you. I find you might remember 2-3 years ago, the chairman of the Nobel Committee pronounced that Americans will not be winning the Nobel Prize anytime soon because their fiction is insular. So Philip Roth is a fabulous writer, but he writes about New Jersey. And does New Jersey in some way represent the human condition? Is a question that the chairman found didn't agree with. So American fiction, in contemporary American fiction, David Foster Wallace, Rick Moody, Jonathan Franzen, DeLillo, Updike.
Mention a woman.
You mention a woman.
Let's get to the other, really.
So,
We'll get to the other thing.
do you find that do you find American fiction insular, and why? If so, why is it insular? Whereas ours is somewhat more political, somewhat more engaged.
Well, they are protected from the reality. They are safe. 9/11 was the first attack on American soil.
Pearl Harbor.
It's,
there was Pearl Harbor.
yes, so a lot of time since Pearl Harbor, and that was during a world war. Here, let's go.
If you actually look at the American novelists who've done the most politically engaged writing of the world beyond America, I mean, to the Nobel Committee, you would have to say William Faulkner, so be quiet, right? William Faulkner wrote about a small little bit of Mississippi, and is one of the greatest writers ever. But having said that, I have enormous sympathy as well for the notion that in the last 10 or 12 years, if you're in America and you want to know what America's been doing in the world, you read Mohsin and Nadeem and Hanif and HM, and these are the Pakistani writers are writing about that engagement. But if you actually look at America in the last 50, 60, 70 years, and you look at those writers who have been writing about America's role in the world, whether it's a Tim O'Brien or a John Hersey or Robert Stone, whatever, a lot of them were actually soldiers. So now you have The Yellow Bird. What was his name? Kevin Powers. Kevin Powers, a fantastic novel that has just come out in America. Kevin Powers was a Marine in Iraq and has written the best first novel out of America I've read in a very long time, which is about being a Marine in Iraq. There's another writer, Benjamin Buchwald, I think, who was also a Marine in Iraq and has written from the point of view of Iraqis. I haven't read that one yet, but I want to. And if you look through the 50s, 60s, 70s, it was men who went to war and then came back and wrote those novels. And something happened when the draft got removed, was that if you were at a certain level of affluence and privilege, you could assume that war would not come to you and you wouldn't directly have your life engaged in it. And if America brought back the draft, you'd get a lot more good novels of the world.
I've asked the panel participants to bring along some of their work in progress or a previous work in order to give us a short reading from from them. So, Nadine, you're sitting here with your book. Yes.
I will begin. I will just read from The Blind Man's Garden. And again, it looks... the book begins in October 2001. So this othering has begun, as it were. And there's a sentence in here which says everything. So Rohan is the chap, Rohan is the blind man of the title. He's not yet blind. In the course of the novel, he will go blind. He's losing his eyesight. And this is him. And his son is called Gio. Rohan looks out of the window, his glance resting on the tree that was planted by his wife. It is now 20 years since she died, 4 days after she gave birth to Gio. The scent of the tree's flowers can stop conversation. Rohan knows no purer source of melancholy. A small section of the tree moves in the cold wind, a handful of foliage on a small branch, something a soldier might snap off before battle and attach to his helmet as camouflage. He looks towards the clock. In a few hours, he and Gio will depart on a long journey, taking the overnight train to the city of Peshawar. It's October. The United States was attacked last month. A day of fire visited on its cities. And as a consequence, Western armies have invaded Afghanistan. The battle of the World Trade Center and the Pentagon is what some people here in Pakistan have named September's terrorist attacks. The logic is that there are no innocent people in a guilty nation. And similarly, these weeks later, it is the buildings, orchards, and hills of Afghanistan that are being torn apart by bombs and fire shells. The wounded and injured are being brought out to Peshawar, and Geo wishes to go to the border city and help tend to them. Father and son will be there early tomorrow morning after a 10-hour journey through the night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Camille, I want to return to something that actually you mentioned earlier today about writing as a woman. There's a lovely book by a writer named John Berger who in his book Ways of Seeing talks about the male gaze. He's writing about the tradition of oil painting in the West, but I think it applies to other media as well, film, novels, poetry, whatever, and not only in the West, elsewhere. And the dilemma is that women have always been the object of the male gaze, and it's something that, according to Berger, we have internalized. And so that even as women writing about women or women painting women, we still tend to do it from the point of view of a male, because that's the perspective that has been embedded in our traditions. Is that something you agree with?
What year did Berger write Ways of Seeing?
70s.
Yeah. Now, thank God for feminism of the 70s and later. Thank God that someone of my generation is able to read Berger, who is himself a wonderful feminist, which not many men are anymore. There were more male feminists, as a historian friend of mine, in the late 19th century than there are today, and I think she's probably right about this. But it's true, it's something you have to learn and recognize and then unpack. But it is true that, I was thinking about the word the other, so in certain places I'm the other. Never more so than when holding out my Pakistani passport at most immigration counters of the world, where the first thing they see is the passport. But I can walk down a street in Istanbul and someone might think I'm Turkish. I mean, it's happened. I can walk down the street in Cairo, someone might think I'm Egyptian. If I walk down a street in Britain, well, you can look like anything and be British. So I'm not necessarily conscious of being the other as a Pakistani all the time, because certainly when I'm in Pakistan, you're the other on the stage here, right, talking to us about our otherness. But no matter where I have been or go in the world, I'm always in a patriarchal society, different levels, and I'm instantly recognizable as a woman. So you're always, as a woman, you're always the other in that way. And most of us don't recognize it or see the ways in which it influences how we think about ourselves, which is why it's something like Berger's Way of Seeing, which is in a lot of ways, to me, that and Orientalism are texts you put together for how do we construct narratives, how do we write, how do we paint, how do we talk. And I mean, I think there is a shift. I think it isn't intrinsic. We aren't born with it. We are taught to think about ourselves in certain ways. We are taught to, but it's true that, you always hear, not always, but you'll very often hear men saying, oh, who can understand a woman? And you won't hear women saying, oh, who can understand a man? Now, a lot of men and even women will say that's because women somehow are more complex and just don't make sense. But the truth is that we have a lot more male voices. We have a lot more male stories. We have a lot more telling us about men in the world. We grew up hearing a lot more about men. And so we, know how to unpack. We understand masculinity and how it's formed.
But doesn't the challenge even go deeper than that? That even as a woman writing about a woman, or as a male feminist writing about a woman, we're still sort of entrapped in certain conventions that are very difficult to break out of. Just for example, it's rare to read a book in which there's a female character whose appearance is not somehow not tied
Sure.
to who she is, to her identity.
Yeah.
You always know what the woman looks like, and she's usually beautiful if she's meant to be a
Yeah,
star
absolutely.
in the story.
There's a set of rules. I wish I could remember who this came up with this, which I saw on the internet the other day, about how to judge a movie in terms of its gender relations. There we go. Do you remember them, the rules? Do you want to tell us the rules? Is there a movie which had... Yeah. Is there a movie which has... Does the movie have more than 2 women characters? Do the 2 women characters have a relationship with each other, or is it just with the men? And do they talk about something other than men?
Or clothes.
And it's astonishing how many movies will fail by those very simple rules.
Right.
You know.
Yeah. So even movies that ostensibly are treating the women as the heroines. Would you like to read something?
Can we ask the men about women?
Well,
Because I think
yes,
that's also what
that's a
happens is
very
that
good
women get asked about women. And
Bravo, good point.
No, I thought this is interesting. You were talking about the appearance of men. Nadine Gordimer was the first novelist I read who described men as objects of
desire?
objects of desire, and I remember being taken aback. That
Yeah.
no, seriously,
How did it make you feel,
I was a
though?
kid. I was 19, 20, and I remember being taken aback that a man was being described in really detailed way.
Yeah.
What his hips looked like, what his chest was like, and it never even occurred to me. And of course, later I read works by other female
Toni Morrison
writers.
does that a lot.
Toni-
Yeah.
Absolutely, and of course,
Uzma Aslam Khan, actually.
Uzma,
Yeah,
absolutely,
Uzma's very good on
she's
that.
brilliant, and of course, gay writers.
Yeah.
And then you learn that yes, this is a thing to be desired. You know, that it had never. She was the first one, and it's interesting that it was a woman.
Yeah.
Go ahead, John.
Women are great. I think Mirza Ruswa's Umrao Jan Ada is a fascinating book because it is fascinating historically, anthropologically, because it's the first novel in Urdu. And because this courtesan, Tawaif, is not how she's depicted in the film, the subsequent film, or that television serial that wasn't very good. She has agency. Umrao Jan has agency, and she makes choices. She's not a victim of. She's not merely a victim of her context. And she has a sense of humor. So, as far as women empowerment goes, you go back to Urdu literature and you find this very unusual sort of character in this very unusual sort of book, and it's a fascinating. I think it's fascinating for many reasons.
I'm going to read a section from Burnt Shadows, since this is about the other. It's an Afghan man and an American woman, Abdullah and Kim. They're in a car together driving to the Canadian border. They don't really know each other at all. So they're driving along. He says, "It was amazing the way America drives when it isn't in New York City. The road signs. We all laughed so much about the road signs." He's describing a road trip he did with some friends. "What's so funny about road signs?" Kim could feel her mouth position itself into a smile, wanting very much to find some shared moment of humor, but unable to see how road signs might lead to levity. "For everything that might happen, there's a road sign," he said. "Deer crossing, moose crossing, old people crossing, children crossing, rock falling, only one rock, that I don't understand." At that she did laugh, genuinely, relaxing her grip on the wheel slightly and becoming aware for the first time how stiff with tension her neck had become. Abdullah almost caught her eye as he smiled and continued, "Bridge ahead, covered bridge ahead, soft shoulders ahead, road widens, road narrows. My friend Kamal, he's Turkish, very educated. He said, what a thing it is to live in a country where every possible happening is announced in bright, glow-in-the-dark letters. We wondered what would happen if something unexpected happened in a country like this without any warning. This is December 2001, by the way. Kim glanced sharply at him, but he was leaning forward, rotating his arm in front of the heating vents to dry off the sleeve of his grey winter coat, and still not looking at her. Then we got our answer, he said, to what America would do if something unexpected happened. Yes, you certainly did. She discovered all the tension in her body seemed to have moved to her jaw, making it difficult to get the words out. This time he looked directly at her. No, I didn't mean. He shook his head, looked offended, made her feel apologetic, then irritated for being made to feel apologetic. That night, on the way back to New York, I was half asleep when I realized that up ahead, all cars were slowing, swerving around something. I woke up fully and imagined someone dead in the middle of the highway. Then I heard Kamal laugh. There, in front of us, lit up by headlights, was a big pile of blue and pink toy animals, rabbits and bears. Kim saw it as he spoke in his soft voice, envisioned something almost reverential about the way all cars slowed and swerved, not daring to run over a little blue tail or a soft pink ear. It would have been a moment of silence, of wonder, she knew, uniting everyone on that dark, dark highway. And Kamal also swerved, she said. It wasn't a question until Abdullah didn't respond, turning instead to look out of the window at the unblemished whiteness. He had cut right through the stuffed animals. Kim found the image grotesque and knew that she couldn't indicate as much without appearing to suffer from misguided American empathy. Cluster bomb the Afghans, but for God's sake, don't drive over the pink bunny rabbits. Could he tell her, Abdullah wondered? Could he say he had asked Kamal to drive as close to the toys as possible, and each of the men inside had taken armloads of rabbits and bears, their fur softer than anything the men had touched in years? Each of them had a child or a nephew or niece or young sibling to whom they would send the toys as a gift the next time one of the lucky ones with legal paperwork left New York and headed to whichever part of the world he had left behind. Abdullah's son now slept with the soft blue bunny the father he'd never met had sent to him via a cabbie from Peshawar. But if he told Kim Burton this, she might think he was a thief.
Thank you. I'm so happy you read that bit about the road signs, because I actually reread Broncheto's preparing for this session and was very taken with that passage. And of course, go out one day and see a sign in Southern California where we're living that says slow senior zone. and I swear I never want to live in a neighborhood that says senior zone. I have a last question to ask, and then we'll open it up to questions from the floor. And this has to do with writing novels. One thing that struck me in reading Said is that he associates novels with imperialism. He has a great book, Culture and Imperialism, in which he says the novel is the art form par excellence of imperialism, because it tells stories, it tells narratives that have a beginning, a middle, and an end that seem to make them seem inevitable, and yet what they do is describe this kind of imposition of meaning on the world that is basically hegemonistic and a tool of domination, in the sort of mode of colonialism. That may be a stretch, and I'm interested in knowing, whether you feel that that's just utter BS or not, or whether the novel is very much rooted in a Western tradition. He, by the way, cites Robinson Crusoe as the quintessential English novel about a man who goes to a deserted island, finds one native, and makes that person his servant. Why are you writing novels? And several times today you've mentioned the first novel in Urdu. Why is it that you're writing novels, and why is it that the best novels that are coming out today in the world are coming out of this region and not, in England, in the West, as you've said?
Well, it's arguable that the English novel, you talked about Robinson Crusoe, that the English novel began as a protest movement, as a social movement. Someone like Dickens was trying to bring news of the other, what was happening in the factories, what was happening in the... So if you look at Thackeray, if you look at Trollope, so this is what these people were trying to do. What it became later is another thing. and why the novels published here are made here are interesting. I'm going to let Kamala deal with that.
If there's one line that the writers I admire quote more than any other, it's again from John Berger, and it's the
Oh,
yes.
Never again will a single story be told as though it were the only one.
This line by John Berger, Colin McCann, Arundhati Roy, Michael Undache, Nadeem Aslam, I mean, so many writers will quote it, will use it somewhere in their work or talking about. And I think a lot of the writing, to me, that's really interesting of the last. And I wouldn't actually, I don't think the best writing happening in the world is coming from here. Toni Morrison lives in America, Marilyn
Yeah.
Robinson lives in America.
Absolutely.
There are two women for you, HM.
Yeah.
Laurie
and-
Moore.
And Laurie Moore. So I don't buy that line. I think because there's a certain kind of interest and people haven't been reading novels from here, there's, some stuff that's happening. But I mean, I don't think it's true at all. But I do think that the novel became complacent in the 20th century. And what you had from, I would say, the 80s onward, and the Indian writers were a big part of this, but then so were, writers like, actually before, because the black writers of America were a big part of it, which is to take the novel to tell a different story, to take that John Berger line, never will a story again be told as though it were the only one, and use the novel as a place where that can sing and live. And I think, for me, that's what I'm interested in the novel, is tell the story, but enter from what angle of history are you entering from? And for a long time, the novel in English written about this region was written by the colonials, and there was, one kind of novel, and that's, I'm very grateful to be born writing in the generation I am. I think the generation before me had a very, very hard time, because for them, English was still the language of the colonial masters. It was filled with colonial assumptions. The colonials told them what a novel looked like, what a subcontinental inner novel did. And because the writers of the 70s and 80s did a kind of work, we can be more relaxed about it. They did the hard slog of figuring out how do you start to tell the stories differently. And then we pick up on that, I think.
I think a novel is sort of the novel as a form is a recent development, but storytelling is innate to the human experience. So we've been telling stories since we assumed consciousness. Neanderthal man had to explain why the sun came up, and there's a story that went along with it. And I mean, there's the Dastan Goi in this region is a sort of a fabulous tradition that is very unlike the conceits that Edward Said hammers down in that particular exposition, where there's a tangible beginning, middle, and end. 1001 Nights goes on and on and on, and there's no tangible beginning, middle, and end. So there are other traditions. We happen to be a function of our age, and I think if in Papua New Guinea, I'm sure the young generation will turn to novel writing because the society is changing. I also have another observation. There's a reason why I find British fiction is somewhat flat these days. It's because you can't, as a novelist, you can't really aspire to write the great British novel anymore. That's been done. I think it was done 300 years ago. In this region, one aspires perhaps to write the great Pakistani novel, and so there's this energy that we have, and that writers writing in different parts of the world. You can't write the great French novel anymore. The greatest contemporary French author is horrible, is Welbeck. He writes about the anxieties of immigration, it's very silly. Gunter Grass wrote about a very interesting, a very complicated time in German history. That's why Gunter Grass is great. I don't know if German literature still has that same energy. We have that energy, and that's exciting to me.
Also, to quote John Berger once again, he said that life outstrips our vocabulary. A word is missing, so a story must be told. In that, if you were to ask me, what is your relationship with this person? And I would say, well, one day this happened, the second day she did this, the third day I did that, then the following week. At some point you would say, stop. You don't need to tell this story. This is called a friend. Now, if I were to say then, and then that happened, and then that happened, you would say, okay, those earlier things were called friend, we don't know what this is. So tell me more about this. In that, because human beings are so complex, and because a society like this is so complex now, that things are changing, as H.M. said, that new things are coming up, new challenges are coming up, that a word is missing to describe what is happening out there. So therefore we need to tell a story about it. So this is why novels coming out of here are exciting. And coming out of those societies at those times were exciting, as it were. Yes.
Would you like to read a section?
Let me read something very exciting. Homeboy is fundamentally a coming-of-age story in the tradition of Huckleberry Finn and Catcher in the Rye and Bright Lights Big City. And at the same time, it deals with these profound socio-historical changes that have swept the world in the last 10 years. The passage that I will read from features the protagonist, Chuck, who's off the boat. Chuck पाकिस्तानी लड़का है, कराची का है, और उसका क्या नाम है, शहजाद नाम है, अमेरिका में चक कहलाता है. So this is his off the boat, come to the US for the first time. We who arrived in the West after the colonial enterprise, after our forefathers, heroes, icons, the likes of Sayyid Ahmad Khan, Malik Rajanand, M.A. Jinnah, found the east coast of the Atlantic habitable, if not always hospitable, but America was something else. The weather was mostly friendly, the people mostly warm, and the premise of the nation, the bit about your bruised and battered, or as my pal put it in his native Punjabi, twade, tute, pute, was altogether a different thing. You could, as Minnie auntie told me once, spend 10 years in Britain and not feel British, but after spending 10 months in New York, you were a New Yorker, an original settler, and in no time you would be zipping uptown, downtown, crosstown, wherever, strutting, jaywalking, dispensing directions to tourists like a Mandarin. You see, you'd say, it's quite simple. The city's like a grid. The theoretical premise of America had more tangible implications. You did not, for instance, have to explain yourself. Learning I was foreign, my college roommate, Big Jack, inquired, "Ain't that in South America?" Testament to the theory of symbolic interaction, perhaps it didn't matter because it's not where you're from, as Rakim once averred, it's where you're at. Sure, they said institutionalized racism was only a few generations old and latitudinally deep, but in New York you felt you were no different from anybody else. You were your own man, you were free. At any given moment you could decide to navigate your way up Fifth Avenue to regard shiny luxury watches, eat a kosher hot dog on Central Park South, or read a book at an outdoor cafe on Christopher Street. And sure, Independence had its dark dimensions, its lonely frequented loci, like a scarred green bench in the northwest corner of Washington Square where nobody sought you out. You would turn up your collar then and sit with your arms folded, regarding the masquerade. You were no different from the next man, the bum, pot dealer, panhandler, booted malcontent. New York could be a lonely place, but over the course of a year, these places became fewer and farther between. I will read one more paragraph. This is our hero's initial perception of America, but then things go bad for him, and this very brief passage depicts how things change. I understood that just like 3 black men were gangbangers and 3 Jews a conspiracy, 3 Muslim men had become a sleeper cell. And later, much later, the pendulum would swing back and everybody would celebrate progress, the storied tradition of accommodation. On TV shows and posters in middle schools, there would be ceremonies, public apologies, cardboard displays. In the interim, however, I threatened order, I threatened civilization. In the interim, I too had to adhere to some unwritten code. Thank you.
Do we have time for a couple of questions? Take 2 or 3 and then they can answer. Okay. Here's someone right behind you, I think, has a question.
This has been a very interesting dialogue, and my question is to Nadeem Aslam. You went to England as a teenager and settled there. So how much of a Pakistani are you?
We'll take all the questions and then answer them at once, okay? So,
my question is regarding your idea. I'm interested in knowing of your idea of a function of a novel. Like you said, as Nadeem Aslam, you said that a novel is a form of a protest. It's to, you even quoted that it's to fill out the missing word that's out there. But is that, what do you think, is that the only function of a novel? Is it to protest only, or do you think it's much more complex and varied than that? Is it only to, for example, address a social issue or a political issue, or what do you feel? Can you talk about that more in detail?
okay. And maybe just one more? Right here?
Do you think it's non-PC or racist for a non-migrant or a Caucasian to write about the migrant experiences in other countries? Thank you.
Okay. So we have 3 questions. One is about the function of the novel, whether it's only social, only political, or something more complex than that. This last question was whether it's somehow racist or inappropriate for a novelist to write about migrant experience in another country, right? And then finally, how much of a Pakistani do you really feel yourself?
I think Kamila asked me in her very first interview which she did for Herald magazine. She said, so do you feel Pakistani? And I sort of didn't know how to answer, and then eventually I said that I don't know, and she says that, what if the Pakistanis called you one of theirs? And I said, oh, is that the question? Yes, I am Pakistani, so I'm going to let you decide whether I'm a Pakistani. And so yeah, it's but the other
let's say
question
we can all do
handle.
one each. So
Yeah.
should I do the migrant and Caucasian one? Will you? I think there's something very problematic in the notion that you are only allowed to write about your own kind.
Yeah, I think
Because when you say that, what you're saying is there isn't imaginative empathy. You're saying you white person cannot understand the Pakistani because something in them or their experience is so alien and foreign that you'll get it wrong. I understand there's a historical position this comes from, which is that a lot of the English have written very badly about the subcontinentals in these imperial texts. The thing is, don't do it badly. Don't do it in an imperial way. My last novel was, my main character was Japanese, who went through the nuclear holocaust. Now, if I, from Pakistan, can decide that it's okay for me to write about a Japanese woman who survived the bombing of Nagasaki, I'm certainly not going to say that an Englishman can't write about, Nadeem Aslam going from Gujranwala to Yorkshire. But do it, be aware of the historical position you're standing in vis-a-vis the person you're writing about. Function of the novel.
What is the question?
What's the function of the novel?
What's the function of the novel? Is it only political and social or more than that?
The novel has many functions. I now need to have a cigarette.
The novel does have many functions.
So thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I'd like to thank our three authors for a very interesting discussion. Enjoy the
Thank
rest
you,
of the
Dr.
festival.
Wyatt.